a mountain. One son and Aunt Deet were climbing the sled from Dorfley up the mountain to where Heidi's grandfather, the villagers exclaimed to Deet.
I must,
Deet.
And I can't take care of her any longer. Let her grandfather manage for a while.
The villagers looked with pity at little Heidi. They knew her grandfather lived alone high on the Alm Mountain, and they were heavy gray eyebrows and a bushy beard. If he spoke at all, his voice was gruff. Poor little Heidi. Heidi stumbled along clumsily, but was hot and red, and no wonder. In spite of the warm June sun, she was wearing for the other, a big red shawl and heavy shoes and socks. She carried her straw hat. All the clothes that Heidi owned were on her back. As Heidi and her aunt climbed up the steep path, they were joined at a rickety little hut by Peter, the goat herd, and his flock of goats. Heidi noticed how easily the barefoot boy scrambled uphill. Without a word, she took off her shoes and socks and dresses and shawl. Then, in her bare feet and underclothes, she as nimbly as any of them, finally reached the Alm Uncle's hut, looking down over the valley. "Well," he asked, "what mean?" Aunt Deet explained how he would have to keep Heidi now while she took a job in the city of Frankfurt. Then, fearing the angry look in the old man's eye, she said a quick goodbye and went back down the mountain. Heidi darted around, admiring the wide view of the valley and listening to the wind in the 3 tall fir trees behind the house.
Where shall I sleep, grandfather?
Heidi asked at last. The grandfather took her into the hut. "Sleep wherever you like," he said. Heidi saw a little ladder going up to the hayloft. Up there, in the sweet-smelling hay, she made her bed. Through a round window, she could look far down into the valley below.
This is a lovely place to sleep,
she called down.
"I know all about it,"
the grandfather called back in a gruff voice. But underneath his bushy gray brows, his eyes twinkled.
"This child is not lacking in brains,"
he said to himself. That evening for supper, Heidi had 2 bowls of delicious goat's milk and some cheese toasted in the open fireplace. Then she went up to her hayloft and slept as soundly as if she had been in the loveliest bed of some royal princess. Every morning, Peter brought the goats up the mountain. He would call for the grandfather's 2 goats, and Heidi often went up to the pasture with them. She and Peter would take a picnic lunch. The day passed pleasantly as they played with the lively animals and picked armfuls of wild flowers. Heidi grew very brown and strong and healthy, thanks to this outdoor life. She was as happy as the merry little birds in the trees of the green woods. When winter snows came, Peter no longer brought his flock up the mountain.
Grandfather, will you take me down to visit Peter?
Heidi asked one day. The grandfather bundled her up in a blanket and sat her on the sled in front of him. Then down the snowy mountain they coasted, the grandfather's gray beard flying out behind him. Heidi shrieked with delight. Peter had an old blind grandmother who lived in the rickety hut with him. She was happiest when Heidi could come to visit her. The grandfather would never go inside with Heidi on these visits, but he brought along his hammer and nails. Each time he would mend a shutter or a door, and soon the rickety little hut was made sound and strong. And then one day, Aunt Deet came back. She came to take Heidi to Frankfurt with her.
There is a wealthy family with a sickly daughter there, and they want Heidi to be her playmate,
she explained. The grandfather was angry at this. Heidi didn't want to go either, but Aunt Deet said,
"You can return soon with some soft white rolls for Peter's grandmother. That will make her very happy."
But when Heidi got to Frankfurt, she didn't like it at all. There was no grass, no mountains, no trees, only houses and streets. Clara, the little girl, had to lie on a couch or sit in a wheelchair all day. For her, the days were long and dreary until Heidi came. Heidi was fond of Clara and tried to amuse her. She once brought Clara a basket of kittens. They turned the whole household topsy-turvy, but they made Clara laugh. The girls had their lessons together, and Heidi learned to read at last. She saved all the soft white rolls from her meals, though they grew hard and stale in her closet. Meanwhile, the weeks dragged on in Frankfurt. Heidi grew pale, and her eyes lost their sparkle. She missed her grandfather. She missed All Mountain. She missed Peter and the old grandmother and the frisky goats in the high pasture. Finally, Clara's father saw how homesick the child was.
Heidi, do you want to go home to your mountain?
He asked.
Yes. Oh, yes,
the little girl cried. So she returned to the grandfather on the All Mountain. But she came back with presents for everybody, and later Clara was brought in her wheelchair to visit Heidi and the grandfather. The meals of goat's milk and cheese were the most delicious Clara had ever tasted, and never had she slept so well. The grandfather made a second bed of hay in the loft next to Heidi's. At night, both of the girls would look at the starry sky through the little round window, and they would fall asleep to the sound of the wind roaring through the 3 fir trees. The grandfather took good care of Clara, and she grew strong and rosy, too. Only Peter was unhappy, for Heidi had no time to play with him anymore. One morning, Peter did something dreadful. He took the empty wheelchair and pushed it down the mountain, so that it broke into hundreds of pieces.
Now,
he thought,
Clara will have to go back to Frankfurt, and I will have Heidi for my playmate again.
But when the grandfather carried Clara outside, he thought the wind had blown the chair down the mountain.
Oh,
Wailed Clara.
now I will have to go home, for I have no chair.
Heidi tried to think of some new plan.
If only you could walk.
She coaxed, and she made Clara stand up while she held Clara's arm.
Now just stamp your feet down and try.
She pleaded. Peter, who was feeling sorry about the wheelchair, came and helped too. And Clara dared to take one firm step upon the ground, and then another, and another.
I can, Heidi. Oh, I can. See? See, I can take steps one after another. I can walk.
And even the grandfather came running to see the wonderful sight that had made them all so happy. When Clara's father arrived to take her home to Frankfurt, there was a marvelous surprise in store for him. Coming toward him from the hut was a tall girl leaning on little Heidi. His Clara was walking.
This is a joy to me, child. This is a great joy to me,
the father cried.
Heidi, you have been such a help. Will you come back to Frankfurt to live with us?
But Heidi clung to the grandfather.
I don't ever want to leave my mountain again,
she said. So Clara's father promised that instead, Clara should come back every summer and visit on the Alm.
And now, he said, it is time for us to go.
Heidi and the grandfather waved goodbye. Then, hand in hand, they turned happily toward their hut, which was all golden in the setting sun. That night, Heidi was very joyful as she climbed up to her bed. She had seen all the mountains and cliffs glowing in the sunset. She had heard the fir trees roaring in the wind. She was at home forever, high on her beloved mountain.